It seems like a long time ago, actually, when Phil, Debbie and I met to talk through the ambitions that we had at Barclays to create a new media partnership and the steps that we were putting in place to make that happen and make it fit for purpose for the future. We actually hadn't finished the RFP at the time, and we were still going through the contracting element. Fortunately, it hasn't been a disaster, so I've maintained this speaking slot to talk to you about it today. As Phil said, Scott's joined me on stage, and we've been working together for the last 18 months, notably on that review, but also on a shared vision to deliver smarter and more effective media partnerships, and that's really what we're going to talk to you about today. Now, in theory, that should be very simple to do and put into practice, but there's no doubt that it comes with its challenges and the need for clear direction and commitment. In an organisation the size of ours and the complexity of an organisation like Barclays, at times we've had sympathy for the Brexit process because it felt like we were managing something like that in terms of the media review. And we also started that review at a time when I think the industry was very hot under the collar around transparency, and it was all that we were hearing about at the time. And in fact, after a while, it started to get quite depressing to hear about this thing called transparency and trust. And it started to imply that there were misgivings about agencies and their behaviours, that they were doing the dirty on clients, and it just continued to add fuel to the agency and client trust debate. Now, it doesn't mean that we didn't think there were challenges out there at the time, but we really wanted to understand the complete picture, and we knew that we had some responsibility to take for the situation as clients as well. So the first thing that we did is we set about a complete internal review. So we looked at everything from our operating model through to our agency relationships, our contract, and most importantly, what our vision was for a partnership moving forward. And it was here that we identified a number of challenges that sort of set the scene for the months ahead, and that we wanted to resolve in terms of our new model and new way of working. And it's that I want to spend the next few minutes talking to you about, and I doubt many of them are unique to Barclays. And then I'm going to pass you over to Scott, who's just going to take you through the detail of what we believe to be a good blueprint for RFPs and media agency partnerships moving forward. So I think the first thing to say is the contract, and you've heard a lot about contracts today. Ours was outdated. It sat in a cupboard for many, many years, and no one had looked at that contract. The industry had moved on, our contract hadn't. It was rooted in an old world and an old model. So the very, very first thing that we committed to doing was rewriting it. And Scott will talk more about that later on. But importantly, it was also the very first thing that we shared with agencies as part of our RFP. Other than an initial conversation with me, it was the next thing that they saw. It really has to be the North Star of your media partnership. It has to be bespoke, and it has to inform the RFP that you run. Again, we've heard a lot today about the work that ISBA have been doing on the new media framework, and we've absolutely utilised that. But we would say that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's an excellent framework, but you have to make it bespoke to your needs and your requirements as a client and also to the agency that you're working with. And we often refer to that internally as flexibility within a framework. The second thing we looked long and hard at is the RFP process and how we run that and experience from what we've done in the past. We knew we wanted to build a partnership, and what we wanted that partnership to do was to allow our media investment to be as effective as possible and create no barriers to the agency for doing that. So the entire RFP process was centered around any agency's ability to build a partnership with us, to build a trusted model, and to do so in a streamlined way. We looked at the contract we developed. We also established a number of tenets, as we call them, which are sort of behavioural contractual clauses that we've built into our partnership. And we worked backwards from there. And the result of that is our RFP process was much less focused or interested on billings and rankings and awards and complex strategic briefs, but much more about partnership. So Scott's going to talk a little bit about that later on. One of the things that did work incredibly well for us up front was something that we used to refer to as redlining. We set out right at the beginning what were the contractual elements and the tenets of our contract that we were just not willing to negotiate on. So when we started those conversations with the agency, we were on a level playing field. They knew what we were looking for, and we knew what they were looking for, and then we moved forward from there. You'll also hear later on from Scott around how we spent time with the media traders, the COOs, the legal teams. They were the first people that we wanted to talk to as part of the process, and typically the ones who get rolled out right at the very end. And actually, they're typically the ones who know what's going on. And we found that really, really valuable as part of this process. The third thing for us is around how you value the partnership. And we committed right up front that if we had the right contract and the right partnership, we absolutely had to have the right remuneration approach. You'll hear us both talk today quite a lot about the value equation, so a fair value exchange. Importantly for us, the value we wanted and we've got needs to be valued in financial terms. So it's not just about understanding the return on investment of your media or the price of it, but it's about the value of your media agency partnership. And until you understand that, you cannot put a price on what it's worth, which is why for us, certain remuneration models that are out there in the marketplace today simply don't work. The other thing that we would say about that is any RFP that sets out an ambition to build a trusted, transparent partnership has to be very clear on how it values and remunerates an agency. And if that isn't done correctly, that partnership and that model simply won't work. Number 4 was around procurement and working hand in hand with them. Simply put, they're not the enemy, and it's something that you hear a lot about in the industry today at the moment. And I think they quite often get a poor rap in all of this. You'd often hear that everything was going so well, and then procurement came into the room and slashed the price. And I'm not here today as their union rep, but I think we all have a duty to work very closely with them, work hand in hand with them. And that was something that we committed to doing right from the very outset. So every meeting, every discussion, every decision, they were involved in, they were front and center in. There's no doubt, certainly in our organization, that they're not media experts. They don't have years of experience in a media agency, but they are experts in procurement, and that's what they wanted. Their jobs are to ensure that we get a fair value exchange, and that's something that we all want. And while our review wasn't sourcing-led, and nor do we believe it should be, they were a key stakeholder around the table, and that's something I cannot recommend more. The media industry is also very complex, and it's often just about helping them understand that a little better, particularly when in their day-to-day roles they may be more focused on buying more tangible items. And I think that leads me on to my 5th point, which is education. A media contract isn't comparable to anything else that's out there in the marketplace at the moment. As I say, you're not buying tangible items, you're buying talent, you're buying experience, you're buying capability, that more often than not doesn't exist internally. You're buying a pool of value, you're entering into a complex, multifaceted contract. So one of the things that we committed to doing was spending hours and hours of time educating everyone in our organization, from our COOs to our CFOs, to our legal teams, to procurement, before we even started this process. We also pre-built our model, so we knew what we were going out to market and looking for, and we also estimated our fees. And we took everyone we could through that, as many people as possible internally through that methodology, right the way up to our board, in fact. And in fact, where we estimated we wanted our fees to be was where we ended up in the end. And that certainly helped us avoid that age-old procurement challenge of a challenge right at the last hurdle. So what I wanted to do there is just set out some of the challenges that we experience, and I'm going to hand over to Scott now, who's going to take you through the model that we put in place.
First of all, I'd like to publicly thank Tom and the team at Barclays. They've made some incredibly brave and progressive decisions in the last 18 months. And one of those was appointing Aperto One, a 2-week-old company on a mission to create positive change. I'd also like to thank Debbie and the team, Isbar, who have also shown incredible support. And I think we all share aligned ambitions. To follow Tom, the starting point at any partnership build, whether that be a media agency review or any other transformational work that you do, has to be clearly creating the vision of what it is you want and why that is important to you. Marketing and media is full of proxies, and we must try to avoid them where we can. The ambition we set ourselves was to create a partnership that empowered the agency to always be able to act in the best interests of Barclays and consistently be able to produce the best work they could. This sounds obvious, but as discussed today, if you have a deep understanding of the media ecosystem, it's not always easy to literally introduce this. And there are so many other factors that will impact your media plan. Further, there was ambition to bring Barclays together. It is a large organisation, but together the plan was to learn and create the ability to take greater responsibility for their media investments. To do this, we had to break significant legacy behaviour and norms, as Tom talked about. Some of that legacy did centre around the process itself. The well-trodden media agency pitch template needed to be addressed. You know it. The RFI, size, billings, conflicts, brand of agency, followed by an RFP process that asks far too many broad strategic questions to be useful. And of course, the pricing grid. For those unfamiliar with pricing grids, they are supplied to the pitching agencies with a media laydown highlighted. The agency is then required to fill this in and explain how much they'd buy it for. Most of this information is then used to help inform the decision of whom is appointed. Sadly, some still use this as a primary decision maker. Having filled in many of these pricing grids, I can conclude there are two types of pricing grid: bad ones and really bad ones. This process is flawed in so many ways that I can't go through them today. You really need to do much more work to understand when a saving is really a saving. Of course, you want an agent to be able to buy as well as possible on your behalf. There are smarter ways of doing this, and that is all about access, openness, and better ways of working. Back to the process. The changes we made to the process were not subtle. For example, the first stage was to clearly articulate the type of partnership and relationship we wanted, and why. As Tom explained, we designed this in detail and ran scenario commercials past all key stakeholders internally, well in advance. And then we used this simple slide of tenets to guide our process. We then asked the agencies if they could show us how they could map to it, and we called this first part of the process partnership evaluation. This involved a demonstration of intent. We met the CFOs, the commercial directors, the heads of trading, the legal teams, the technology leads in the very first meeting. And we took them through what it was we were trying to achieve in terms of a partnership. As part of this, we began to look at the contractual terms and commercials. It was a very open phase, and ultimately we were front-loading what is vitally important. We covered very quickly the principles and tenets of the partnership that were key, and ultimately we tried to gain the trust of the agencies. Plenty before have talked a good game, but in some way or another have defaulted to legacy. The contract, as Tom said, was also shared at the beginning. The ISBAR framework, version 1, was a part of the media schedule's backbone. On top, we layered the spirit of the partnership, lots of behavior, and perhaps we did take transparency a few steps further forward. So to pick up on what Tom was saying earlier, we do go through to the AdTech global contract. And we were looking to go deep into the digital supply chain. The contract is vital because it holds the entire partnership together. Getting it right is essential, but far from easy. We spent significant time getting that right. The approach was well received by the agencies, fortunately. It was the first time any of them had taken part in an exercise quite like this. And although a few savvy observers have now followed, we absolutely advocate pushing contractual and commercials to the front of the process. On partnership building, throughout it is vital to communicate with crystal clear clarity what it is you're trying to achieve and then never deviate. This makes progress easier for both sides. The measurement of that partnership is then what follows. Too often we are measuring the wrong things. Often we measure what is easy or indeed possible. And that is where proxies are created. In a media agency relationship, some of the key elements you should measure are service and thought leadership, difficult to measure, but measurable. Shared business objectives. If we win, you win. All companies have clear business objectives, and media contributes. It may not be a direct correlation, but you should share ambitions with your agency and commercially recognize those. Of course, there are marketing objectives that should be built in as well, especially around things like the spectrum of brand scoring. We also advocate measuring the slightly less glamorous but key areas like financial due diligence and ad safety. No one wants invoice queries or credit notes, and slightly less annoying, ads appearing in inappropriate content. As touched on, there was one area that we have included that we're careful as to how it was incorporated, and that was pricing. I'm sure that all in this room would agree that price is only a component part of value. Value is what should be measured, never pricing in isolation. For all the clever ROI methodologies, econometrics, attribution, and often clear business objectives, agencies are still largely, significantly, rewarded based on various forms of benchmarking and pricing exercise models that are murky at best and flawed at worst. Reported media pricing discount is perhaps 60% real, and it is 40% a manipulation of numbers. If you want more that does less, ask your agency to chase price. Just for clarity, I'm not suggesting that any one element of the media supply chain is solely at fault. It runs all the way through advertiser to media owner via agencies and consultants. Therefore, to be progressive, you really need to think about where this fits into any model you build. I would also recommend that in this partnership, you don't too heavily link pricing to fees or PRF. So how do you pay them? Remuneration. The only form of remuneration that works is a dynamic fee model, set on an annual value, but with triggers that allow it to flex. There should be no place in this industry anymore for commission models. They incentivize the wrong behavior and do not create a stable platform required for the best work. An agency should be telling you when not to spend money and know that they're able to invest in the teams that they put on your business. The size of that fee is dependent on what is required, and a fair value exchange should be agreed. Further, your model should ensure that this fee is the only income an agency earns from your money, which links to transparency. Please remember that transparency is two ways. In fact, it should go further than that. Agencies will open up. Advertisers just need to empower this. Part of it is a fair value exchange. The other is return transparency and respect from the client themselves. Further, those independent monitors charged with measuring success in media must also be willing to lower the drawbridge and allow scrutiny. To that end, transparency goes much deeper than the sales side of the digital supply chain. And I'll finish on partnership. The structure of this partnership behind me is very simple, really simple. What Barclays have done in multiple markets is bring this to life. It is real, it is fully transparent, it is fair, and it is next generation. I hope that more will follow, as the more smarter partnerships that are built, the stronger our wonderful industry will be. I'll now hand back to Tom to finish.
Thanks, Scott. So we're roughly about 3 months into this new model and the new partnership that we have with Omnicom Group. So I thought it'd be worth spending a few minutes on some of the learnings that we've had, because the process hasn't been entirely perfect, and the model's not entirely perfect, and we continue to learn every day. I think and there's 5 of them up here that I want to talk through. So I think the first thing to say is, and I'm sure you don't, but don't underestimate the time and resource it takes to manage building a model like this and a partnership like this and an RFP that supports it. It's a great deal of time, great deal of hard work that needs to be invested. And the other piece I would say is don't underestimate the value of third-party resource as part of that process. I have to say it because Scott's on stage, but we've benefited from his experience, also from ISBAR as well, and also other third parties like legal firms who have specialist expertise in the area of media that we simply didn't have internally. So don't be afraid to use those. Scope of work is also key. This is something that we actually underestimated right at the outset. We just didn't do enough work to articulate what it is we wanted from our partnership in terms of delivery. And we have subsequently done that, and we've invested an awful lot of time in developing a very clear, very accurate scope of work, because without that, it was almost impossible for us to determine the value of the relationship that we were putting in place, and also measure the delivery, as Scott talked to. It sounds obvious, but stay committed. We experienced a great deal of challenge as we went through this process, particularly internally and particularly from people who didn't understand media. We've seen a lot of people struggle on a day-to-day basis to step out of legacy ways of thinking, and we've had to continue on this education journey, which is something Scott and I spent a lot of time doing. Most importantly, we've got the ambition to change, but we are continually educating people around the benefits of this model and why it's the right thing to do. RFPs is an interesting one. When I started this process, I had this grand ambition to sort of run the shortest RFP the market had ever seen. And actually it ended up being about 12 months long. And I think there's very good reason for that. Something of this size and complexity cannot be shortcut. So I hear a lot of people at the moment talking about shortcutting RFP processes and doing them in a couple of weeks. And I think you have to be very careful about that. To build the complexity of a partnership like this, particularly to get your contract right, that takes time, energy, and commitment. And I don't think that process should be shortcut. Absolutely, your RFP has to be tailored, it has to be meaningful. There's no point in wasting anyone's time as part of that process, but certainly don't shortcut it. And then the final point I would make, which again seems quite obvious, but we've only just realized, the contract is a living document. It's something that we've committed to reviewing on a quarterly basis with our agency partners, and we will continue to evolve that, and we will develop it and build it out on a more regular basis than we've ever done before. We're already 3 months into the partnership, as I've mentioned, and we're already keeping track of enhancements and changes that we want to make to that contract all of the time, and it goes back to that ethos of flexibility within a framework. So that really just gives you a taste of the learnings that we've gathered over the last couple of months. I just want to finish by saying that we are proud of the partnership and the model that we've built internally and with Omnicom Group. It's certainly brought us together across Barclays, but more importantly, it's created a blueprint for agency contracts and partnerships moving forward that we certainly don't intend to limit to media agencies and partnerships alone. So thank you.